Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see some new faces. At the bottom of page 85 with the words that begin the paragraph, right, which is to say. So 63 in the white books and year in this book on page 85. So we were speaking about the human image. And in general, I think that one of the lines we said maybe summarizes well what we've been studying about, and that is that we shouldn't think ourselves of human beings experiencing maybe a divine experience here in this world, but quite the opposite. We're divine beings in a human experience. And what this means is that the human image is bedded with God's DNA, and therefore we are divine beings, and we each have our own missions to bring heaven down to earth, so to speak, in our own way, here in this world, in this human experience that we may be experiencing. We spoke a lot about the distance between God and the human being, which is unhealthy, and the more we recognize that there's God everywhere, the more we can also connect to our personal divine mission of our divine beings. I would quote the Mishnah, and we can jump right to it. But I would quote the Mishnah. There's a beautiful teaching from the Ethics of Our Fathers, authored by the Mishnaic sages of some 2,000 years ago. But the teaching says that whoever is studying Torah, and he interrupts his study because he sees in front of him a beautiful tree, so he interrupts his study to say, wow, how beautiful is this tree? Ethics of Our Fathers tells us, he is bringing condemnation upon himself. Why? If you see a beautiful tree, are you not allowed to interrupt your study and say, wow, this is a beautiful tree? What are they trying to teach? Does anyone have an idea? Just curious to hear your perspective. What's wrong? If I'm studying and I see a beautiful tree, it could be a beautiful tree, it could be a beautiful bird, it could be a beautiful whatever, flower, butterfly, and I say, wow, this is so beautiful. So there's a take that goes as follows, which is consistent with the main message thus far, and that is that, what does it mean that I'm interrupting my study? What the word that is used in the Ethics of Our Fathers, mafsik mi mishnato. What does it mean I'm interrupting, I'm stopping my study? That I am actually of the philosophy that there is God's world, and that's in the Torah, and that there's the human world, which is in trees and butterflies and birds. That they are two separate things, separate entities. That's why, if I am of that philosophy, I'm bringing condemnation upon myself, because there is no such thing as two separate worlds. God's world is everywhere. God permeates even the trees. If I think that I have to interrupt my study to learn from a tree because God is not a part of that tree, then I'm bringing condemnation upon myself. Again, we have to see this oneness, this continuum in every area of our lives, including in trees, in continuum of God. That's right. God is everywhere. And if I think that a God in the Torah and there's no God outside of that Torah, then that's condemnation. I bring condemnation upon myself. But if I see this continuum, that God is really everywhere, He permeates every tree, every butterfly, the Torah and the tree. You know, Rabbi Steinsaltz, the author that I'm very close to, he would often say, I remember him being, you can Google it, being interviewed by so many from the New York Times to you name it. And they would ask him, why are you such a, Rabbi Steinsaltz himself is a chemist also, he has a PhD in chemistry. He's a walking encyclopedia. He knows everything about anything. I remember walking with him at the San Diego Zoo, and him analyzing every animal from every perspective, biological, zoological, Torah-wise, everything. And he would often, so they would ask him, wow, you're such a complex human being. You know it all. And he says, no, I'm not complex. I just see God everywhere. And that's the point here, seeing God everywhere. If I think that God is only allocated to certain compartments, then I bring condemnation upon myself. That's right, to stop. That would be a better translation. Mafsik mi mishnato, one who stops his study. In other words, that's it. Now I'm moving from one compartment to a different one. And I can't see the connection between these compartments made by God Himself. That's right, if you stop. But again, in the sense that you are viewing God's creation as compartmentalized, fragmented, while there's really this oneness. I think that, I think that's one of the great mistakes we make. I think maybe that's one of the great mistakes American Jewry makes, maybe some other parts of the world, Jews in other parts of the world also make. And that is that we have relegated God to the synagogue. to the study place, to the yeshiva, to the Bet Midrash. If I want to find God, I have to come to synagogue. Not that God is not in the synagogue. God is also in the synagogue. But he's just as much in your bedroom and in your kitchen as he is in the synagogue. Sometimes he's even more in your bedroom. His presence is felt even more in your bedroom than he is in the synagogue. God is everywhere. To relegate God to certain places, to certain moments. Yom Kippur is the holiest day. No, it's not true. I mean, maybe it's true in one sense, but today is the holiest day. I remember meeting a Hasidic Jew by the name of Rabbi Mendel Futterfass, who was a man who suffered tremendously in Russia, in the Gulag, for 20 years, just for being a proud Jew under communist Russia. And he once called a Hasidic Jew, and I had a similar experience with Rabbi Steinsaltz himself, in fact, but he asked him, what is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar? And this guy tells this rabbi, Yom Kippur. He says, you're wrong. Today is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. He says, what's the holiest place in the world? He says, well, Jerusalem. He says, you're wrong. The place that you're stepping on right now is the holiest place. He says to him, what is the holiest being in Jewish history? He says, maybe the high priest on Yom Kippur. He says, wrong. You are the holiest being. And if we could view ourselves in such a way that God really permeates everywhere, God expects every place to be holy because he's found in every place, then I think it would create this fundamental shift in the world that would certainly make it holier and better. But unfortunately, we say, oh, you know what? God only belongs to certain places, which is exactly what he's fighting against here thus far in this chapter. So let's continue. Which is to say, the non-physical essences. Does anyone want to read? Right, so just a small introduction, maybe a Kabbalistic introduction, which really should not have been needed if we had started on chapter 1 instead of chapter 3. But the author himself, Rabbi Steinsaltz himself, suggested to start on chapter 3, and therefore we didn't start on chapter 1. But if chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this book speaks of the four worlds that are spoken of a lot in Kabbalah. And that is that there are four worlds in God's universe, so to speak. There's this world, which is the lowest of all worlds, and that's called the world of action, Olam HaAsiyah, because really the focus in this world is action. Then there's a world above this, and that's the world of angels. It's called Olam HaYetzirah, which means the world of formation. Then there's a world above that. That's called Olam HaBriyah, which means the world of creation. That's where souls come from. And then you have a world above that, which is the world of emanation, Olam HaAtzilut, which is really where this light that he's speaking about comes from. Now, in a way, that gave birth also, especially what he's speaking about here, to this notion, and I apologize for the heaviness of these topics, but this notion of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a very, very big topic in Kabbalistic thought, but tzimtzum means contraction. And that is that if this world indeed is the lowliest world, and the world of emanation is the highest world, that's where everything emanates from, then this world, because it's so lowly, can't contain the light that is found in the world of emanation. Think of a power station with electricity, right? You can't have this power station in this light bulb. It's going to explode. It needed to contract itself in order to finally shine some light. Now, in a way, that's the way we view the worlds. There was this tzimtzum, this contraction that happened and that continues to happen from the world of emanation to the world of action, to our world, for us to be. Otherwise, there would be so much light that we would completely dissipate. I think our souls would expire. It would be too much for us. I think it's reminiscent of, in fact, in this week's portion, we're about to read about the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments delivered on Mount Sinai. The Midrash tells us that God was the one who uttered the first two of the Ten Commandments. And Moses uttered the rest. Why? Because when God spoke the first commandment, our souls just couldn't take this light. So they expired. Our body was crushed, was too limiting for this voice. And then he revived us miraculously, according to the Midrash, God spoke a second commandment, and again we expired. It was too much. We have some types of experiences like this. I mean, some people die of heavy news, this trauma that's created. There was a tragic story a few months ago in Israel about a couple who lost their son, the young son, and out of grief, the father died during Shiva, while sitting Shiva for his son. But sometimes you have, now the opposite is true, right? You have experiences like that where your soul just expires. So after the 2 commandments, God revived us, and we told Moses, hey, you speak to God. We just can't contain this anymore. And let him tell you the rest of the 8 commandments, and we'll listen from you. And that's why this changed. But again, if there was this light that we find in the upper world, in this world, it just wouldn't be able to contain it. Yes, but that's the whole point, and this is exactly what he's saying. The whole point is to, as we are living in this world, to not interrupt. Speaking of mafsik, right? Not stop our thought and our focus from this idea that really this world is just representative of the upper worlds. It has this light, just in a contained and contracted way. And every human being, therefore, as we said, is the holiest. Every place is the holiest. Every day is the holiest. Every layer of this world is founded upon this light, and it's nurtured, continues to be nurtured by this light. I think, we're speaking Kabbalistically and mystically, but imagine that's the way we would view our children. We would view strangers. We would not view them as just a body or the accumulation of matter, but really of divine lights. I think our world would change. Wow, you represent God. I think it would unleash the God in everyone. It would reveal it all of a sudden. If I see someone as godly, maybe he'll start seeing himself as godly. We would live a whole different world with a whole different level of consciousness. But again, this idea stems from these four worlds being utterly connected, and this light from the upper world contracting itself for us to be, and that's why it needed to contract itself. But again, the focus must be on the light in everyone. We have a soul conference coming up. I'm going to plug it in, but we have the soul conference coming up on Sunday evening and Monday, all day learning with an all-star lineup of world speakers. And by the way, it's all based on Rabbi Steinsaltz's book called The Soul. It's a different book. I know he has a chapter here called The Soul of Man, but Rabbi Steinsaltz has a new book, but not so new, but 5 years old. It's called The Soul. That's why this conference is called the Soul Conference. But the Soul Conference book, The Soul, came about. Why? Because of Rabbi Steinsaltz's obsession, I would say, that we start seeing each other as souls. We don't start seeing each other as bodies. We start seeing the soul in everyone. Just before his stroke, it's interesting to note, but just before his stroke, I sat down, I had the privilege of being in Israel, and I sat down with him for about 3 hours late at night. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning. That's the best time to catch him. Otherwise, it's too busy. He doesn't sleep. Man really doesn't sleep. But we sat down for a long time, and I remember him almost like as a semi-prophecy. I asked him, how are you? And he hates the little formalities of life, like get to the point. He usually would say, if I would say to him, how are you? Says, just get to the point. Just I'm fine. What now? What? And same would be vice versa. If he would ask me how are you, and I would say Baruch Hashem, he says Baruch Hashem what? Blessed is God. What? Good or bad? Get to the point. But in any case, when I asked him this time, how are you? He started saying that he doesn't want to be like Menachem Begin. I said to him, what does that mean? And he said Menachem Begin was the type of man, whether he agreed with him, didn't agree with him, but he was a type of man who he had so much life, so much force. And towards the end of his life, he started losing it completely until I don't know if you know how he died, but he secluded himself completely and lost that life and that passion that he had. He doesn't want to become like him. And then he quoted a verse in Psalms that says, "At tashlicheni le'et zikna, kichlot kochi al ta'azveni," which means, please do not send me to an elderly age where my strength will leave me. And then 2 weeks after that, he had a stroke. But in any case, in that conversation, just thinking of this, in that conversation, he told me about how he truly believes and that's the only reason he does what he does, that everyone is on a trajectory to finding that divine self. We have people that have to go through a lot of things until they discover that divine self. But he truly believes that that's the case with everyone. And he told me the story of Moshe Sneh. Moshe Sneh was a Zionist leader in the early 40s and 50s in Israel. He has a son named Ephraim Sneh, who was the minister of transportation some 20 years ago. If you're familiar with politics, with Israeli politics, you're familiar with the name. But Moshe Sneh was a man who was a fascinating human being because at the beginning of his life, he was a very staunch communist. And then he became a big, what's called a secular Zionist. And he was going through all sorts of things and imposing all sorts of harsh decrees in Israel, especially particularly against religion. And Rabbi Steinsaltz once sat on a panel with him. And during a break, he approaches Moshe Sneh and he says, you know what, you remind me of another guy named David Rosenbaum. David Rosenbaum was a man who at the beginning was also a very staunch communist. Then he became a secular Zionist. And then towards the end of his life, he revealed this divine self and he changed. He transformed himself. He had the third stage of life where he really embraced his divinity and started really acting in a much more divine and refined way. So he said to Moshe Sneh, you remind me of this guy because you had stage 1, you had stage 2. When is stage 3 coming about? Now he was expecting, some dismissal, but he said that Moshe Sneh became very serious. And he looked at him with tears in his eyes and he says, Rabbi, it's much closer than you can think. At proving the point again that there's a trajectory of life that really leads people to discovering the divine self. And I think that in a way, by asking that question, maybe Rabbi Steinsaltz triggered that response, triggered that revelation in him. But I think that's the way, again, we should view each other. We're not human beings. We are divine beings in a human experience. Again, being nourished by these lights that are all the way high up, all the way in the world of emanation. That's it. Okay, 86. This marriage between the non-physical and the physical, which is sometimes a marriage that is filled with tension. And most of the time, I would say, it's a marriage that's filled with tension. But if we really believe that every physical is an element of non-physical light in it, then really the duty of man then becomes to find this perfect harmony between the two. Because if they are left as is, can create much tension. I would say I'm reminded of the Hasidic saying that says that almost summarizes man's mission in this world. Generally speaking, of course, everyone has their own individual mission. But this Hasidic saying says that God created something from nothing, right? This world is something that came from nothingness. And our duty is to recreate nothing from something. So in other words, to find that God in that something and return it to its source. That's the duty, to create this harmonious marriage between the physical and non-physical. I think that's, it's an idea that's become, I think, much more prominent in the past century, I would say, than it was maybe many years ago. I think psychology and the world of psychotherapy and etc. relate exactly to that. It's the recognition that what you see is not what you get. What you see is just a physical layer, but there's so much more to what you're seeing. By the way, it's interesting to note, and I don't know if we've mentioned this in the past, but I think that's why the most important prayer in Judaism is what? Shema. The Shema, right. The Shema Yisrael is the most important. What does Shema mean? Listening, to hear. Because really, Judaism is a faith of listening, of hearing, not of seeing. We don't believe that seeing is believing, as it says. No. What you see, you can't believe what you see. There's so much more. What do you have to do? You have to listen. You have to connect so much more profoundly to everything. To human beings, obviously, when you're there speaking with them. But even to this table. Is this table just a piece of wood? Or is it something much more than a table? Is there an element that's non-physical in this table? That's the idea of listening, of connecting from that standpoint. That's why we close our eyes when we say the Shema. Because what we're saying by closing our eyes, and we do this, we say that, well, one second, we don't want to be bothered by our eyes. Our eyes distract us. They only allow us to see the physical. We have to be connecting here to the soul of things. That's really the idea. And when a person is able to connect to the soul of things and find the soul of things, then he's able then to somehow create a marriage between the soul and the physical. If we would treat this table just as a piece of wood, then, we might treat it with less respect. We might treat it also, as something that's useless. Now it's serving us to study. Look how much holiness we're adding to this table. We're reconnecting the holiness of this table to the holiness of this study. And then we treat it not just with more respect, but I think we treat it with a layer of divinity. And it changes our approach to things. And in a way creates this, again, marriage between the table and the words of Torah. There's Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Interesting. Rabbi Yitzchak Luria was one of the foremost Kabbalists of Tzfat some 400 years ago. And there's a story about how he was giving a class. He would give classes, by the way, not in his house of study, but very often he would go out to the fields to teach his students, believing that holiness is to be spread, can't stay in the confinements of walls. And Rabbi Yitzchak Luria was once giving a class. You can believe this or not. He was giving a class, and a dog came, a wild dog. No owner came and kept bothering them. And the students tried to banish him from the class so that they could focus. And Rabbi Yitzchak Luria said, leave this dog alone. Leave him alone, because he's really a soul. You didn't have the privilege of studying in his previous life. Now he came, so he wants to listen. Now, in a way, I think it's beautiful because, again, it speaks exactly to what Rabbi Steinsaltz is speaking here, that everything has a soul. But you're going to relate to a dog just as a bothersome dog? No. Maybe he has a soul. Maybe you need to create this perfect marriage between the dog and the words of Torah that are being taught by Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. That's really the idea. So in every non-physical, there's physical in this world. Every physical, there's a non-physical. And our duty is to create this perfect harmony between the two. But I would say it's also a question of approach, because Judaism is unique in the sense that we see this marriage between the physical and non-physical. Buddhism, for example, says that, we can't deal with physicality in order to be holy, so we have to divorce ourselves from it. So let's not marry, let's live and meditate in the mountains, which is fine. They become maybe heavenly like that, but that's not the goal. The goal is to really create this marriage between the two. Now, in general, you have three approaches. Two of them are quite easy. You have a third one that's most difficult. You have, again, the approach that was just mentioned, where you say to yourself, I can't deal with this world, I'm escaping to a more heavenly state. That's pretty easy. Then you have the other approach, on the other extreme, that says, you know what, this world is too powerful for me, its temptations, etc., are too powerful. I'll be entirely materialistic. I'll ignore the non-physical. That's also very easy. The hardest one of all is to say, you know what, there is this world, and there is this upper world, and they don't have to divorce themselves. Quite the opposite. They yearn to find this harmony. So it's my task to somehow create this harmony. So when I'm stepping on a rug, and I say, well, this rug is not divorced from heavenly spheres. So it's an approach of seeing the two really together, not running away from them, from one of them, but really seeing the two together. I will say this. There's a story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson. Every single week in front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who would give his Hasidic discourses each and every Shabbat, yet they couldn't be recorded because it was Shabbat. So he would have, Simon Jacobson himself, together with a team, would have to memorize all of these words. And these words were spoken for 5 hours, 6 hours sometimes. And then immediately after Shabbat, he would write them down, get his team together. They would hand them over to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would edit them sometimes and then say, now you can publish it. But this is a man who absorbed so much wisdom, and so much. And really, just it's not just the absorption of wisdom, it's also the ability to analyze it, to write it down, to make sense with it. So it's tremendous. So he'll be here Sunday night and Monday. He's one of our speakers. why am I thinking of him? Why am I thinking of the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Because there's a great story that my friend experienced. Rabbi Schneerson was once walking with a few children up the stairs of a big ballroom in Brooklyn, New York, where he lived, and that big ballroom housed a yeshiva also, and a place, where you had bar mitzvahs and weddings and so on. He's walking up these steps, and at the end he says to the children, how many steps did we just climb up? And the children don't know. I mean, they were, awed by the Rebbe. They were taken by other things. He says to them, I'll tell you how many. 15. I think it was 15. And it corresponds to the 15 steps found in the temple, in the Jerusalem temple, where the Levites would stand and sing. The Cohens also would then be, after those 15 steps, ready to worship and sacrifice. Corresponds to that. Now, you think to yourself, yes, one of the holiest men in our generation, who certainly belongs to a different sphere. He sees things we don't see. Yet he's so grounded that he can count those 15 steps even as he's walking and thinking other thoughts. I think that, to me, is that perfect marriage. That you are up there, but you're also down here. Or as Hasidim like to say, you're in this world, but you're not of this world. Or as they say also, you are within, but stay above. And that's that perfect marriage. It's like the plus and the minus of electricity that creates light. Very good. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, you just remind me. I mean, speaking of him, very often there would be flies as he was speaking, immersed in this Hasidic talk, and these flies would come. And most of us, what we do is like, move away already. And he often would be, all the time, he would be so gentle with the fly. And I asked him why, just get rid of it. He says, well, it's God's creature also. He too has a purpose. There's a soul even in a fly. The Hasidic Jews tell this story about how a cemetery in Russia, some 150 years ago, take the graves from one cemetery, move them to a whole different part of the city. Why? Because the Russian government wanted to build a highway right through the cemetery. In any case, they tell the story of I think it was Rabbi Levi Berdichev, or maybe someone else, but one of the great rabbis, who, when they took out his body, even though he had died 100 years before that, his body was still fully wholesome, as if he had just died that morning. And the story is told, by the way, by many others, about many others. In fact, the Talmud tells the story of how the Romans came to Beitar, the city of Beitar, and they killed whoever they could see, and these bodies were left wholesome for weeks and weeks and weeks. By the way, the three boys that are right here on the memorial, the three boys who were kidnapped and then murdered in the summer of 2014 in Israel, they were found after 3 weeks, that they were abandoned in some field outside of Hebron. And Racheli Frankel, the mother of one of the three boys, tells the story of how, by the way, she'll be here for the Soul Conference too, but she tells the story of how the bodies were wholesome, as if they had just died that moment, even though you would expect them to disintegrate. Now, why does this happen mystically, based on this? Because those are people who recognized that the bodies were not just bodies. They were souls. So they treated them as souls. They treated them as infinite beings, infinite entities, as godly entities. And when you treat a body like that, it becomes like that. And then it's also infinite. That's really the explanation that mysticism has for this phenomena. All right, I have to run. Thank you very much again. Let's schedule 2 weeks from today. And welcome again to everybody, really. Welcome. It's great to have you. And you're always welcome. Okay, so the 26th.
Thank you.
Thank you.